All right, good. So data management policy covers a bunch of the controls related to data management. So specifically data classification, and we'll talk about, what that means, why it's important, as well as handling and retention. I would say those are like the big three. So as we go through it, we'll pick up any other, bits and bobs as we go along. So let's start with classification. So if you remember, like a cartoon when, they have some secret documents and they stamp them top secret, that's classification and labeling. But the idea is you have all this information. It has different levels of sensitivity. And so how do you know like what level of sensitivity a particular document has, and how do you manage that in a systematic way that's organized? You classify the data based on its sensitivity, and then you can assign handling controls to that data based on its classification, right? So obviously things like the military, secret, top secret, that's a classic context. And so ISO in particular tells you to do this control in the Annex A. The weird part is if you think about like a commercial organization, especially a smaller commercial organization, that's not something that we like normally really do in a formal way. We certainly don't typically label everything. And if we protect things more intuitively, let's say. So, as you get into a formalized audit scheme like SOC 2 or ISO, you're going to then move into that class where you want to start classifying them more formally in order to adhere to those standards. Okay, that's the high level idea here. Now, what classification schemes should you use? And here you have total flexibility. In a way, I would say less is more. The more levels that you have, like the more potentially complicated it could get. So I would say very classically, like 3 levels or 4 levels is very common. And then what words do you use? This also needs to be an organizational decision. Because different words mean different things, but common labels would be like, confidential, sensitive, restricted, or public, or you could do something, more proprietary, as you'll see in this particular example. Since we're using Vantas, we do something slightly more proprietary because we want to call out certain things. So we're going to first classify the data. We're going to set our classification labels. Then we're going to put data into those buckets and say, hey, this level of data is this level of classification. Then we're going to put handling controls on top of that, and then maybe some retention and or destruction. So that would be the other part of the life cycle. Is like, how do you dispose of it then at the end? Good. Any questions there so far, Casey?
Are there any what are the general classifications that the bare minimum that maybe somebody should have in this policy?
Yeah. Okay. So when I think about this conceptually, and don't worry so much about the labels, like the words you use, you can choose that, but I think of 3 kind of classic buckets. So one is the most sensitive stuff, like stuff that needs to be rigorously protected and cannot be shared. So oftentimes, anything that is obviously sensitive, like a credit card number, a social security number, driver's license number, DOB, oftentimes, any sort of sensitive personal information might go into that bucket. User IDs and passwords, right? Like credentials, keys, encryption information, all that stuff would be like highly, highly sensitive. And then for many SaaS companies, your customer data often goes into that highest bucket. And you might say like, oh, well, my customer data is not like that sensitive, right? And that might be the case, but just because of the business need to protect customer data and the pain that you go through if that gets breached, oftentimes we just put customer data in that most sensitive bucket anyway. So that could be like sensitive data, it could be confidential. Those are probably the 2 most common labels that I see for that. So that's bucket 1, like the crown jewels, the most sensitive stuff that you have to protect. Next bucket down, I would typically call like restricted. Okay. I think here we're calling it internal. So the idea here is you have a bunch of corporate information that you don't want to share publicly, but it's not like life and death, right? It's like, new designs for your product, just internal comms, talking about competitors, things that you don't want to get out there. But if they do get out there, it's not a reportable breach, it's not like a regulated thing. It's just like looks bad or, tacky, bad look, whatever. That would be typically like internal or restricted data. What do we have in here? So like email, Slack messages, design documents, contracts. Some people might put contracts in that highest bucket, but we have it here. And you can slice and dice and put things in different buckets as you choose, right? So that's like the middle bucket, the stuff that you should protect, but it's not life and death. It's not reportable, things like that.
If somebody, for example, had like, I don't know, some PII piece in their internal here or their like low risk bucket, what is an auditor going to say? I know that's kind of an extreme one, but like.
Yeah, sure. That's a good question. So it depends. It depends, right? If you told me that you had, social security numbers, date of birth, and medical records in the middle bucket, I'd be like, that doesn't pass the smell test. That's a problem, right? Like it doesn't make logical sense that you're not protecting this. This is regulated data. This is high, impact to the data subject. If this gets breached, like that's not reasonable. However, not all personal data is created equal, right? So names and emails, business title, business phone, right? Mm-hmm. Like these things are personal data, but they're not super sensitive. They're like quasi-public, right? Like the stuff you'd put on your business card. You share that pretty liberally. You don't always share it, right? Because it depends on what the context is. And if you need to think about that or like understand that conceptually, you think about this, your name and your email. It's not super sensitive when you're at a conference. You're like, hey, I'm Matt. I work at Vanta. I want everyone to know that because I want them to, come contact me if they have a privacy or compliance concern. However, if it was my name or email associated with, XYZ, some sort of like website or service that I didn't want people to know I was a part of, right? Then there it would be very sensitive to me and I'd want to keep it private. So there's a little bit of devil's in the details, but my point is highly sensitive personal information should typically be in a very restricted bucket or that highest bucket, but then low-level personal information could easily be in this sort of middle bucket. Does that make sense?
Yep, exactly.
Okay. And then the third one is public information. So this is stuff that like, we have, but we're fine to share, right? Like stuff that we're going to easily distribute, no big deal. You could have a fourth, we tease it out. We do some things around like customer data because it's one of our crown jewels. You could have more than that, right? You could have 10 levels, but just from a practical standpoint, unless you have if you're going to have a lot of levels, you definitely will have a clear business need to do that. And if you're just doing this for compliance, do like 3 levels, like keep it easy. Good?
Yep.
Okay. Now we're going to talk about handling, like when does this need to be encrypted? Another big one is, can I put this on my phone or my BYOD phone or on a thumb drive, something like that? So tangentially, there's other controls around protecting removable media in ISO. That's annoying, having to encrypt thumb drives is annoying, but in many times in a SaaS type environment, like you don't actually have to do that, right? You don't have to transfer something on a thumb drive. The only time you can use a thumb drive is if you're did a PowerPoint for a presentation and you're at the conference and you need to transfer it to the organizer, something like that, right? So one way you can address that is you can just say, hey, I'm going to set rules that no confidential data shall be put on thumb drives, boom. So you're just denying it by policy. You could enforce that more, in a stronger fashion by having like technical controls around your USB, but you don't have to do that, right? You can set the controls based on your understanding of the risk. And so you can then set rules around how data gets handled. And then typically there's an inheritance scheme. So, as it gets more sensitive, you basically inherit all of the handling controls from the lower level into the higher level. And then you add some, right? So you can look through the details here in the policy. So the template has a lot of the detail. I'm not going to go into that unless you have specific questions, Casey. But this is the idea. You're setting rules for how this information should be handled. And of course, the most sensitive information should always, should be encrypted at rest wherever possible or in use, should always be encrypted over a public network. Those are some kind of basics. Should generally not be allowed to leave a corporate device, unless you have a strong business need where you need to do that because you're not controlling it, things like that. Groovy?
Yep.
Okay. So we're going to go through this is like some examples of handling. We can keep going down.
Internal.
All right, now retention. So in this particular example, we refer out to another policy. If you didn't have like a separate data retention policy, this would be a good policy to have your retention scheme in. Now I'm going to caution you here. I don't like the idea of setting retention based on classification. Like classification should be a factor, but generally the classification bucket is going to have a lot of disparate stuff. And I feel like it's a hard way to manage it if you're going to set your retention based on its classification. To me, that's just as weird or hard. I would set my retention scheme more specifically on the type of data that it is or the system that it resides in. That's just my personal preference and my advice. If you want to do it different, feel free. But the idea here is you're going to then, set data retention, timeline schemes, etc. This is a very important part of privacy. This is also a very important part of de-risking your business. So as a general rule here, slightly tangential to the policy, but let me just say, don't retain data that you don't have a business need to protect. Okay, or sorry, business need to use. What you're doing when you do that is you're creating risk for yourself with no benefit. So it's fine to have risk if the benefit is worth it. But I'll give you an example. Applicants. You have applicants for jobs that you post. And you get, it's awesome. Lots of people looking for jobs. You get 100 applicants for every job that you post, right? And then you just put those in your applicant tracking system and you just append them forever and you never delete it, right? Well, what if that gets breached? Now you have personal information like name, address, phone number of potentially hundreds or thousands of people from the last 5 years that you don't even care about. You're never going to even use it. You just didn't think to go delete it. And so now you may have to report to them. You may have to include them in like a bucket of like how many records were breached. Lots of things could happen around that. So if you don't need the data, delete it. Get into the practice of deleting it. And that applies across your whole digital surface. Obviously, personal information is a big one because it's regulated in many cases. But other information too, if you don't need it, it's you're paying for it in your cloud service. And if it's not providing you benefit, why do you have it?
One other example maybe would be like Slack retention policies would fall in here and like what you do with all your Slack messages, all that good stuff.
Okay, well, that can be controversial, but absolutely yes. Say you were a legal team and you don't want risk. Well, people talk about lots of stuff in Slack, right? It's pretty casual, medium. And, if a company gets a discovery demand in some sort of lawsuit, let's say it's from a competitor or, whatever it might be, as soon as they get that demand, like they must retain the stuff. But if they don't have that demand letter and they deleted it the day before, then too bad, it's gone. So as a defensive measure, yes, certain companies, I might know a couple of those, have pretty aggressive, deletion schemes or very limited retention in Slack because you don't know what's in Slack and you don't want it hanging around. And if people want to store data long-term, they can use other services to do that.
Does this also cover customer data or is that in a different?
It absolutely covers customer data, and that's a great point. So a couple things here. if you have customers, if you have any sensitivity in your customer data, your customers are probably going to be sensitive about how long you retain it. It's a standard question in questionnaires. So they're going to ask you a time of onboarding. And if you give them a squishy answer or a bad answer, that could actually be a blocker in your sales process or just friction. So that's one reason to not retain it. Particularly if they're a European company where GDPR is very much a part of the culture. The expectation is you're not retaining data post termination in particular, except for a very kind of limited functional tactical window with a business justification. So people expect their data to be deleted. And then another thing would be potentially in contract or in a data protection addendum. More mature organizations will often stipulate in the contract a retention period. And so if you don't delete it within that period, you're violating the contract and now you have a legal issue potentially. And then lastly, ISO has some soft language around this, around compliance and contractual compliance in 27001. I believe 27701 has something stronger, but certainly SOC 2, if you're doing confidentiality, your commitments around data deletion and your retention and the controls around deletion will definitely be tested in SOC 2 confidentiality. And I've seen this be a problem for folks because it's a process that exists but often doesn't get tested in real life. And now you have an auditor that's, specifically sampling and saying, hey, who churned over the last 6 months? Go show me that you deleted the data, in accordance with the contract or the commitment that you made.